the woman known to history as Empress Matilda was most likely born on the 7th of February 1102 at Sutton Courtenay in Berkshire in southern England. Her father was King Henry I of England. Henry was the youngest of the sons of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who in 1066 had led an army across the English Channel and began the conquest of England from the Anglo-Saxons and Danes. Henry had claimed the throne following the death of his brother, King William II, also known as William Rufus, 2 years before Matilda was born, the previous king having been killed in a hunting accident which some viewed as suspicious. Matilda was named after her mother, Matilda of Scotland, a daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland and his wife, the Anglo-Saxon royal princess Margaret of Wessex. Because of this lineage, Matilda was descended from the Norman kings of England, the Dukes of Normandy, the kings of Scotland, and also the old Anglo-Saxon rulers of England prior to the Norman conquest. She was one of just 2 children resulting from Henry and Matilda's marriage. The other was a boy named William Adelin, who was born a year and a half after Matilda. As a male child, William became heir to the throne at his birth, but should anything happen to him, Matilda would become Henry's heir, though this would be problematic at a time when rulers above all else were expected to be military leaders. Henry also had over 20 children through his mistresses, but these were illegitimate and could not succeed him. Matilda was born into a political world in Western Europe which was much more complex than it is today. The divided nature of the region would have a bearing on her entire life. Matilda's father ruled England, which was already a reasonably centralized, unified kingdom, with growing influence over the Welsh lords to the west, and at least for a temporary period, reasonably good relations with Scotland on account of Henry's marriage to Matilda's mother, who was a Scottish princess. Things were much more complex across the English Channel. Here, Henry and his wider family ruled over the Duchy of Normandy in the north, while also having influence over some other territories, such as the County of Blois, through marriage alliances. There was a King of France here who ruled from Paris, but he in no way controlled territory approximating to the French nation-state today, though lords such as the Dukes of Normandy and the Lords of Anjou were nominally the underlings of the French king and owed him feudal homage. To the east, Germany was similarly divided into dozens of duchies, counties, and principalities, but, as in France, there was a semblance of centralized authority in the shape of the Holy Roman Emperors. At the time of Matilda's birth, Emperor Henry IV was the current Holy Roman Emperor, though from 1098 onwards he had begun to rule in association with his son and heir, the future Emperor Henry V. Though it may have seemed like a distant terrain to her growing up, events in Germany would play a role in Matilda's life from a very young age. We have a number of important medieval chronicles and histories extant for the history of England and Normandy in the 12th century, which are the principal basis for accounts of Matilda's life and reign. There are also sections of numerous chronicles and histories of 12th century Germany, which refer to Matilda in light of her marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor between 1114 and 1125. Many of the English chroniclers, including William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, were contemporaries of Matilda and wrote extensively about her life and claims to the English throne. A few of these are positive, though the majority present a negative picture of her, notably the Gesta Stephani, which transliterates as the Acts of Stephen, a text which unsurprisingly enough, given its title, was a partisan account in favour of the claims which Matilda's cousin Stephen had to the English throne. Unfortunately, a biographical history of Matilda's life, which was written by the French bishop and chronicler Arnulf of Lisieux, was lost in the late medieval period, a text which would have shed further information on her life, character, and reigns in Germany, France, and England. There were also numerous histories and treatments of Matilda's claims to the English throne written by Tudor historians in the 16th century, a period in which the rapid succession of Queen Mary I and Queen Elizabeth I in 1553 and 1558 animated Englishmen to reconsider the history, merits, and nature of female monarchy. These chronicles provide a patchy account of Matilda's early life. She was raised around an itinerant court which often moved between England and northern France, with her father and mother residing for periods of time at Westminster near London or at Rouen in Normandy. It was an extensive court, one comprised of lords from England and France, where French was the lingua franca. Although she had only one full brother, Matilda grew up amongst a large brood of nearly 24 illegitimate half-brothers and half-sisters, and numerous first cousins, including the children of her father's sister Adela, Countess of Blois. She may have received some education and tutoring from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, one of the most learned men in Christendom at the time, prior to his death in 1109. Other monks and bishops would also have tutored the children of the royal court at a time when educational standards in Europe were experiencing a major period of growth, which has led historians in recent times to speak of a 12th century Renaissance, which presaged the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. Matilda's formal education was a truncated one, owing to her position as a political pawn in the politics of Europe. As her father's only legitimate daughter, the issue of who Matilda would marry was always going to be an important one. As early as 1109, there were diplomatic negotiations underway between Matilda's father and Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful figure in Central Europe, for the emperor to potentially marry Matilda one day. Despite the roughly 20-year age difference between them, the overtures could not be ignored from such a prominent figure, and in 1110, when she was just 8 years old, Matilda was sent to Germany as part of a diplomatic mission where the diplomats who accompanied her finalized the negotiations with the emperor. Despite her ludicrously young age, Matilda's father agreed to the betrothal of his daughter to the emperor, and thereafter she was raised for the next 4 years in Western Germany in order to acclimatize her to the German culture and the language of the people she would become empress of in years to come. Even by the standards of medieval Europe, the decision to hold a wedding ceremony in January 1114 at the city of Worms, when Matilda was still a few weeks short of her 12th birthday, while Henry V was at least in his late 20s and perhaps as old as 33 years, was unusual. Typically, marriage ceremonies were not held until the participants were at least 13 or 14 and were deemed to be entering their young adult years by the standards of the time. Matilda would spend just over a decade as the Holy Roman Empress, the most senior royal woman in Germany. It was a tumultuous period in imperial history, as her husband was, in effect, at war with the papacy in Rome for control over northern Italy, a major part of the Holy Roman Empire at this time. Henry V had even been excommunicated with papal sanction in 1112, 2 years before marrying Matilda. In the first years after the marriage, Henry spent much of his time campaigning south into the plain of Lombardy, and after a time, Matilda joined him there with her entourage and household staff. At one point, in 1117, even heading south towards Rome itself, as the emperor tried to seize the Eternal City. Curiously, despite her young age, Matilda was playing an active role in political affairs by 1116 and 1117, with evidence pointing towards her attending government councils and acting as an unofficial sponsor of political measures that arrived to the imperial court. In 1117, she also claimed the title of Holy Roman Empress, as Henry emerged as the victor of the military clashes in Italy. However, the title was not given the imprimatur of Pope Paschal II, and whether she legally was entitled to call herself Empress, or simply held the more junior imperial title of Queen of the Romans, was a matter debated for years to come. Matilda consistently maintained that she was the Empress Matilda, even long after leaving Germany. In 1118, Matilda's significance in her husband's government was made clear when he himself returned to Germany to quell growing unrest amongst several feudal lords there, and left Matilda in charge of the imperial government south of the Alps in his absence. She played important roles during the years that followed, notably in the resolving of the investitures controversy, a long-running dispute between successive Holy Roman emperors and popes since 1076, over whether the emperor had the right to appoint archbishops and bishops in the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, or whether the pope had the final say in investing these ecclesiastical offices. The controversy was finally resolved by the Concordat of Worms, agreed upon in 1122 in the German city which bears its name. Matilda played an unofficial diplomatic role in the reaching of the major compromise which gave the emperors and the popes different roles in investing bishops across the empire. The trajectory of Matilda's life was immensely altered by the events of the 25th of November 1120. That evening, Matilda's brother and the heir to the English throne, William Adler, set off with a large contingent of nobles and courtiers to sail from Barfleur in Normandy across the Channel to England. As well as William Adler, several of the king's illegitimate children were on board, though Henry himself was not, having already made his own preparations for sailing back to England. The party is believed to have had a lot to drink before boards into battle. This was also the case in France, where traditional law dictated that the position of queen regnant was not permitted, but instead only a queen consort to a king regnant. Aware of these issues, Henry would call his lords together on numerous occasions throughout the 1120s and into the early 1130s to have them swear formal oaths to uphold his plans for the succession. As a backup, he also married for a second time to Adeliza of Louvain in 1121. This marriage, however, would prove even more unsuccessful than his first when it came to producing legitimate children. No children resulted from it, and Matilda would remain Henry's sole legally viable heir. One of the other problems which Matilda's potential succession presented was that she was an absentee heir. Back in 1114, she had married the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. While this was a politically important marriage to one of the most powerful figures in Europe at that time, it also meant that she was living in Germany and other parts of Central Europe in the early 1120s, even as Henry was trying to convince his lords to accept her as his heir. In an age before any form of mass media, such as printing, having a physical presence in one's dominions was extremely important. It was why kings and queens regularly went on journeys around their kingdoms in order to be seen in the flesh and reassert their authority to their subjects. Matilda's absence in Germany was doubly difficult because of this. After all, the lords of England really had no idea who they were being asked to swear oaths to in the early 1120s. Perhaps Matilda was a strong, poised woman who could make a good ruler one day. On the other hand, perhaps she was the direct opposite of this, a weak-willed, insignificant person who could not be respected as a potential heir. The point was that nobody could be sure, and this made Henry's task all the more difficult. In the end, the English king's son-in-law, Emperor Henry V, resolved this problem by dying prematurely in May 1125 of some form of cancer while campaigning in the Low Countries. He and Matilda had no surviving children, though, as noted, a child had been born years earlier but died in infancy. The imperial title thus passed to Lothair of Supplinburg, Duke of Saxony. Freed from her marriage bonds and with no children or family tying her to Germany, Matilda returned home to England in 1126. There, her father's knights and lords would have had their first sustained impression of the woman who Henry wanted to rule over them one day. They should have been reassured to some extent. Matilda was a poised, capable woman, one who might not have been able to lead them into battle in the traditional sense, but who many would have believed could make a good queen. Still, others could never be convinced of the plausibility of a female monarch, and others were disillusioned more broadly with high levels of taxation which the king was imposing and which deepened their opposition to his succession plans. After a spell in England, Matilda crossed the English Channel and took up residence in Normandy. Here she continued to style herself as Empress Matilda despite the death of her husband, the Emperor, in 1125, an affectation which subsequent chroniclers and historians were happy to continue, and Matilda remains known to history as Empress Matilda to this day. In France, her father soon arranged another marriage for her. This time, the proposed groom was Geoffrey Plantagenet, the son and heir of the Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine. The counties of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine were sizable feudal lordships which lay to the south of Normandy, north of the county of Poitou, and to the west of Paris. They covered a substantial proportion of north-central France, and so Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey was, at least on the surface, an astute move, which ensured Matilda would have financial and military backing if she had to fight for her crown after Henry died. Yet the marriage was problematic in other ways. Geoffrey was still 10 weeks shy of his 15th birthday when they married on the 17th of June 1128, and once he succeeded as Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine the following year, he soon developed a reputation for heavy-handedness which aroused the animosity of some of the more minor lords of Normandy to the north. This alienated some further potential supporters of Matilda, though in the end the resources which Anjou was able to bring to bear after Henry's death were crucial in keeping Matilda's hopes of claiming the throne alive. The late 1120s and early 1130s were difficult years for Matilda. Much of this was brought about by the ongoing issues concerning the succession. By this time, Matilda's first cousin, Stephen of Blois, was emerging as a clear rival. Back in 1125, around the time Matilda's first husband died and she began preparing to return to England, Stephen had married Matilda of Boulogne, who had just succeeded as Countess of Boulogne. This made Stephen lord of one of the foremost polities of northern France, one which lay right on the coast of the English Channel, as well as further lands in Kent in southeast England, further strengthening his position. Meanwhile, Matilda's marriage was troubled, and within a year of it Matilda decided to leave Anjou and went to live in Normandy. A reconciliation was arrived at in 1131. However, the entire situation had irked Matilda's father, who believed she was letting her personal feelings get in the way of the need to find a lasting political solution to the succession crisis. The last years of Henry's life witnessed a steady decline in the relationship between king and daughter, though he never indicated any shift in his thinking on the succession. That Henry was steadfast in his determination to have Matilda succeed him was, perhaps, the result of the events of 1133. That spring, Matilda gave birth to her first child, a relief after a long and largely childless marriage to Emperor Henry V and several years of marriage to Geoffrey without an heir there either. Born on the 5th of March 1133 at Le Mans, the boy was named Henry by his parents after his grandfather the king, a pointed statement to Matilda's father and the political realm at large that Matilda now had an heir of her own, and if she did become queen in succession to her father, it would be an interim reign of sorts in preparation for the eventual accession of another King Henry one day. The king was elated, and the birth led him to cross to Normandy to see his grandchild. A reconciliation seemed to have been effected between he and Matilda. It was short-lived, though. A year later, Matilda gave birth to another son, this one named Geoffrey. The birth was difficult, and it seemed that Matilda would die at one point, leading to a new dispute with her father about the terms of Matilda's own will and her proposed burial place. Thus, the rapprochement between father and daughter did not last long. Matilda's father died on the 1st of December 1135 while in Normandy. Even though he was around 67 years of age at the time, he had been campaigning in northern France against a rebellion of some of the lords of Normandy at the time of his death. Though the king had never flinched from supporting Matilda as his successor, his daughter and son-in-law were offering some support to the rebel lords at the time of Henry's death. The king's death was rumoured to be due to eating too many lampreys, a kind of fish. Perhaps some form of food poisoning was involved, although his death at such an advanced age could also have just as easily been from natural causes. As the news spread, it became evident that Henry's lords and knights did not all intend on supporting Matilda's claim to succeed him. Instead, many began scheming immediately. Stephen of Blois, Matilda's first cousin, quickly seized the initiative. Within a week of the king's death, he was in England and gathering support from senior church figures and nobles. Then he gained the acclamation of the people of London, and finally was crowned as King Stephen I at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December 1135, just 3 weeks after Henry's death. Stephen had managed to secure the crown in breach of the wishes of Henry I, in large part because of propitious timing and positioning. When news of the old king's death began to spread, Stephen was not far away from Normandy in Boulogne and was best placed to cross quickly to England. The same could not be said of his brother, Theobald of Blois, another potential candidate for the throne. Similarly, Matilda was further south in Anjou and barely had time to react before news arrived that Stephen had been crowned at Westminster in England. Another reason why Matilda was able to do little to prevent Stephen from seizing the crown was that she was pregnant again when her father died, and in mid-1136 would give birth to her third and final son, William. Each of her sons, Henry, Geoffrey, and William, would be known to contemporaries and for centuries to come by the names Henry Fitz-Empress, Geoffrey Fitz-Empress, and William Fitz-Empress. Fitz meaning son of, and Empress referring to Matilda's decision to continue using this title long after the death of her first husband. Matilda and Geoffrey did not immediately commence a war with Stephen to try to reclaim the throne for Matilda. They simply were not in a strong enough position to do so. Instead, they would wait a few years, slowly gathering allies and preparing militarily and financially for the coming war. What tipped their hand and what led to the outbreak of the civil war known as the Anarchy was when numerous powerful lords of England signalled their support for Matilda's cause and opposition to Stephen in 1137 and 1138. The most prominent was Robert of Gloucester, an illegitimate half-brother of Matilda's, whom Henry I had promoted to become an earl and to hold extensive lands in England. From Stephen's first arrival in England in December 1135, he had indicated his reticence to accept his cousin as the new monarch, attempting to block his coronation. He was joined in now throwing his backing behind Matilda by Ranulph of Chester, another powerful English earl with considerable land and support in the northwest of the country. Matilda also gained the support, for a time, of King David of Scotland, who hoped to gain further lands along the border through his involvement in the Civil War. The anarchy began when Robert of Gloucester rebelled in 1138. The following year, Matilda arrived to England at the head of an army from France. Over the next few years, the conflict would develop, with Matilda, Geoffrey, Gloucester, and their other allies holding much of the West Midlands and West Country for Matilda's cause and establishing the port city of Bristol as their base of operations, while Stephen retained control over London, the surrounding home counties, and East Anglia. Most of the fighting in the anarchy would play out in the Midlands and regions like Oxfordshire, which lay between Bristol and London. In the war which followed, Matilda most certainly lost the PR campaign. While the German chroniclers who wrote about her time as the wife of Emperor Henry V between 1114 and 1125 were generally favourable towards her, as were many French writers, in general, Matilda was perceived badly by the English chroniclers and historians. They viewed her as a foreign upstart who was married to the much reviled Count of Anjou. Why this was the case is not entirely clear. Stephen, who was portrayed much more sympathetically by chroniclers like William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, was hardly an Englishman himself, having been born in France, hailing from Blois, and being Count of Boulogne in northern France prior to seizing the throne of England. Conversely, he had spent periods of time in England since the mid-1110s and had extensive estates there, whereas Matilda, though born in England, had always been a distant figure in Germany, Italy, and France. Stephen also appears to have been more humble, whereas English commentators were at pains to stress Matilda's proud and often overbearing nature, something which led one writer to refer to her even in her later years as being of a tyrannical disposition. All of this was evinced in her insistence on being termed Empress Matilda. Unquestionably, the most consequential events of the anarchy, other than those that brought it to an end many years later, occurred in 1141. Early that year, Stephen was laying siege to Lincoln Castle when Robert of Gloucester marched with several hundred knights and a large contingent of Welsh allies to relieve the siege. The Battle of Lincoln ensued on the 2nd of February 1141 after Gloucester and his forces arrived. It was a decisive defeat for Stephen, one in which he was abandoned by many of his allies under pressure from Gloucester's forces. Stephen and his own entourage became surrounded in the midst of the melee, and despite their efforts to fight their way out, Stephen was captured by Gloucester's forces. Now a prisoner, he was taken west towards Bristol, where Matilda ordered his imprisonment in Bristol Castle. This incredible victory left Matilda seemingly victorious, though Stephen's cause was not defeated. No sooner did word arrive to London and Westminster of the king's capture than his wife, confusingly also named Matilda, began gathering forces to strike back against the Empress and to keep Stephen's cause alive. The brief war of the two Matildas which would follow would soon lead to another major shift in the military and political landscape. All of that lay in the months ahead. In the immediate term, Matilda had won a major victory over Stephen and had her great adversary in captivity. She now moved to claim her birthright and fulfill her father's wishes for the succession by becoming ruler of England. And yet, there was a peculiar aspect to this. Although Matilda generally used the title of Empress, and she was now aspiring to become Queen, she did not adopt either of these titles, instead issuing royal charters and grants under the title of Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English. In early April, she and her followers, along with some leading figures of the English Church that she had won over to her cause, arrived to Winchester, home of one of the greatest Gothic cathedrals in Europe and a very important centre of the medieval English Church. There, Matilda was made queen in a makeshift ceremony. However, a subsequent campaign to try and seize London failed, and Matilda gained neither the acclamation of the people of the capital nor was she crowned at Westminster. This was despite winning over Geoffrey de Mandeville, who controlled the Tower of London at the time, yet when Matilda advanced to try and enter London, the inhabitants indicated their clear unwillingness to allow her entry. Somewhat surprisingly, she did have the agreement of Stephen himself, who told some of his supporters to agree to the coronation of Matilda, perhaps fearing that he would be murdered at Bristol if he did not. Nevertheless, many people continued to view Matilda's coronation as entirely illegitimate. Matilda did not have long to enjoy her success. The other Matilda, Stephen's wife, Matilda of Boulogne, had gathered sufficient forces by this time that she was able to begin campaigning into the Midlands with the aid of her brother-in-law, Henry, Bishop of Winchester, and William of Ypres, a lord of the Low Countries who had brought mercenary troops to England to aid Stephen. On the 14th of September, they descended on Winchester and thoroughly routed the forces which were gathered there in support of Matilda. The rout of Winchester was significant in that Robert of Gloucester was also captured during the fighting. With her foremost ally and half-brother now in the hands of Stephen's wife and his allies, Matilda had no option but to arrange for the release of Stephen from Bristol. Hence, not much more than half a year after defeating Stephen at Lincoln, capturing him and having herself proclaimed as Lady of the English, Matilda was forced to release her cousin, and the civil war was back to being as contentious an affair as it had ever been. Because Matilda did not renounce the titles she had adopted in April 1141, It is usually held by historians of the period that there were, in effect, two monarchs of England that had been crowned in different ways, King Stephen and Queen Matilda. This situation would continue throughout the 1140s. This was a period of a truly peculiar amount of instances in which the leaders of the Civil War were captured, imprisoned, escaped, or narrowly avoided being detained. Matilda herself had two close calls. The first came in 1141 when she was at Devizes Castle in Wiltshire. It had been built a half a century or so earlier by the Bishop of Salisbury and became one of the foremost strongholds in southwestern England by the end of the reign of Henry I. Matilda was here in 1141 when some of Stephen's forces arrived there. They appear to have been unaware that Matilda was at Devizes. Nevertheless, any effort by her to try and escape would have resulted in her being detected. Consequently, she decided to sneak out by dressing in burial clothes and then being tied down onto a funeral bier. Her attendants then carried her out of Devizes as though they were removing a corpse. Apparently, Matilda stayed in her prostrate and bound position for many hours until the company had made their way entirely out of the region in which Stephen's forces were marauding and to the safety of Gloucester. Later, her forces recaptured Devizes, and she would reward the inhabitants for their help in aiding her escape, granting them a royal charter to hold markets as a small borough town. A second close call occurred in 1142. After the rout of Winchester and the release of Stephen and Robert of Gloucester, the fighting in 1142 began to centre on Oxford. Stephen became aware that Matilda had moved her government here by that time and came to the conclusion that if he could capture her, it would strike a definitive blow and end the war. Thus, in the autumn, he advanced on Oxford, the site of an impressive castle and a town which had already emerged as a centre of higher education. Caught unaware by the advance of Stephen's forces, Matilda and her followers were trapped inside Oxford Castle as a siege began from September 1142 onwards. By the winter, over 2.5 months into the siege, conditions inside were dire, with Matilda and the others short of all manner of supplies. Stephen's plan to capture her was nevertheless foiled. In December, the Lady of the English and a handful of close followers escaped from Oxford Castle and avoided detection by Stephen's troops to make their way back west towards Bristol. There are differing accounts of how she made her escape. One has Matilda simply leaving through a postern or rear gate of the castle. Another tale, a more romantic though not implausible one, claimed that Matilda and her allies shimmied down a rope out of a window of the castle to safety and then made their escape dressed all in white to camouflage themselves against the snow which had blanketed Oxfordshire that December. Whichever is true, we do know that Matilda made yet another narrow escape and continued to fight on against Stephen into the mid-1140s. While the war had taken many shifts and turns in England in 1141 and 1142, matters were more clear-cut in northern France. Here, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had invaded Normandy and largely took over the duchy for her cause in the early 1140s. Normandy would remain under Angevin control for the most part of the remainder of the war, with Geoffrey effectively adding Normandy to the counties of Anjou, Maine and Touraine to become a French lord who could rival the King of France in terms of the size of his lands and power. By this time, the battle lines of the war had clearly emerged. France was lost to the Angevins, whereas In England, Matilda controlled the West Country, West Midlands, and part of the northwest of England, while Stephen had a solid base of support in the south, the home counties around London, north to East Anglia, and further north again towards York. The Midlands were the front lines, though the Anarchy, as the chronicles written at the time make resoundingly clear, was leading to devastation all over England as local lords and knights used the chaos and the breakdown of royal power as an opportunity to extend their own lands and benefit themselves. The mid-1140s was a period of relative inactivity in the Civil War by comparison with the dramatic events of 1141 and 1142. First, the two sides became evenly matched and consolidated their control over various parts of England. Then, events far away to the east conspired to limit the scale of the conflict. In 1144, the county of Edessa, one of the 4 major Christian Crusader states that had been established in the Levant as part of the First Crusade half a century earlier, was captured by a Syrian Muslim warlord by the name of Zengi. When word of these developments arrived to Western Europe, a new crusade was preached and gained huge support. The King of France, Louis VII, was amongst those who took the cross and headed for the Holy Land. With their liege lord having committed to the Second Crusade, many French lords, the backbone of Matilda's support in the civil war with Stephen, agreed to head east as well, though some were diverted to Iberia in the end, where Lisbon was conquered for the Christian cause in 1147. To compound matters, several of Matilda's other allies died during the mid-1140s, including Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, who was killed in a military clash against Stephen's forces in 1144, and her most faithful ally, her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, who died nearing his 60th year in a relatively peaceful repose at Bristol Castle in the late autumn of 1147. All of this ensured a lull in fighting during these years. The period that followed saw a fundamental change in the nature of the war. By then, Matilda's eldest son, Henry Fitz-Empress, was entering what would be considered his teenage years today, but which in the medieval era were deemed to be the first years of adulthood. In such a situation, he was increasingly presented as the potential future king if Matilda and her allies were successful in the conflict, with the possibility even that Matilda would rule in association with her son. As early as 1147, when he was just 14, Henry crossed to England from northern France at the head of a large force of mercenaries that had been hired to compensate for the loss of many troops that had headed on crusade. A symbolic changing of the guard followed as Robert of Gloucester passed away, and then Matilda left England herself in 1148. The latter decision was partly taken owing to a clash between Matilda and the Bishop of Salisbury, Jocelyn de Bohun, over the ownership of Devizes Castle, the stronghold in Wiltshire which Matilda had made her dramatic escape from disguised as a corpse back in 1141. The bishop claimed control over Devizes, even though Matilda often resided there. The dispute had escalated in the mid-1140s, with de Bohun even involving Pope Eugene III. Deciding to cut her losses, and with her son now playing a more prominent role in affairs, Matilda headed for France. She would spend most of the remaining years of the Civil War at Rouen in Normandy. The political situation continued to shift in the period that followed. A critical moment came when Matilda's second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, died suddenly and unexpectedly at just 38 years of age, in September 1151. A chronicle written by John of Marmoutier claimed that Geoffrey had been attending a council of his nobles and advisers at Le Mans when he suddenly came down sick with a severe fever. His illness was swift and he died on the 7th of September. He was buried in Saint-Julian's Cathedral in Le Mans, where Matilda had an effigy of him placed over his tomb. On this, his personal coat of arms, which included a blue shield and gold lions, was displayed in one of the earliest examples of the use of a heraldic coat of arms in medieval Europe. It is significant that Matilda commissioned this, and the coat of arms in question influenced the royal coat of arms of the English monarchs in centuries to come. Geoffrey's death otherwise cemented Henry's status as the leader of the war effort on his mother's side, as he became Count of Anjou, now aged 18, and effectively Duke of Normandy as well. Already emerging as a shrewd military leader and political ruler, Henry, in conjunction with his mother, began playing a diplomatic game in the early 1150s, whereby the papacy, the King of France, and the Lords of England were all courted to support Matilda and Henry's claim to the throne, the realization being that diplomacy might gain what war had failed to acquire over the previous decade. On the opposing side, a rival was emerging to Henry. Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, was a few years older than Henry and was being presented to the English political nation by Stephen as his successor. This was even more relevant on that side of the English Channel, as Stephen was upwards of a decade older than Matilda, and it was probable that he would die before his first cousin. Thus, from Normandy in the early 1150s, Matilda was conscious that the clash was now to see if Eustace or Henry would succeed Stephen. The days when she might claim the throne herself and rule in her own right in realization of her father's wishes so many years earlier were passing. Events culminated around the siege of Wallingford Castle in 1153, where Stephen hoped to defeat one of Matilda's major English allies, Brian Fitzcount. Henry campaigned against Stephen to prevent this. After a stalemate had been reached yet again that summer, an agreement was reached, variously known as the Treaty of Wallingford and the Treaty of Winchester. Through this, Henry agreed to end his efforts to supplant Stephen and accept him as King of England, with the condition that when Stephen died, Henry would succeed him, not Eustace or any of Stephen's other sons. The Treaty of Wallingford had seemingly brought the anarchy to an end after 15 years of civil war and decades of tension over the succession. One wonders what Matilda's reaction was in Normandy when news of the agreement which her son had reached arrived there. The settlement was perhaps not as concrete as it appears, though. In the months that followed, Stephen embarked on a flurry of activity to rouse his allies and tour England. It leaves the suspicion that he was making plans to try to renounce the agreement and commence the war again once the time was politically advantageous. However, just as the death of members of the royal family during the White Ship disaster in 1120 and of old King Henry I in 1135 had led to the anarchy, the deaths of two royals in quick succession ended it in the mid-1150s. First, Eustace died unexpectedly in August 1153, and then Stephen died just over a year later in October 1154. With this, the anarchy came to an end. Matilda was victorious, though the victory was largely for her son, who quickly secured control over the government of England after Stephen's death. He was crowned on the 19th of December 1154 as King Henry II at Westminster Abbey. Fittingly, during the ceremony, one of the crowns which was used was that which Matilda had brought back from her time married to Emperor Henry V in Germany 3 decades earlier, a symbolic statement of how Henry's mother had kept her line's claim to the throne alive since her days in Central Europe as a young woman. With the death of Stephen and the accession of her son as King Henry II, Matilda found herself for the first time in nearly 2 decades not fighting a war to claim her birthright and to implement the wishes of her father. She had not become queen herself, but her eldest son, who she had symbolically named after his grandfather, had. Matilda was victorious, and she now entered a period of quasi-retirement. She did not live in England, remaining instead in Normandy and spending the remainder of her life here. Although Henry was the Duke of Normandy, his mother acted as one of his senior representatives here as the new king, unlike his great-grandfather and grandfather, William the Conqueror and Henry I, viewed himself primarily as an English monarch rather than a French lord who just happened to be King of England as well. During these years, there was also a symbolic effort to acknowledge Matilda's position as the daughter of King Henry I. Consequently, despite her retirement in Normandy, we have royal charters and other government documents from the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s which bear both Henry and Matilda's names and royal seals, a tacit acknowledgement that although Henry was the king, he had only become so through his mother stepping aside to allow him to succeed Stephen. During her later years in Normandy, Matilda became a major patron of the church and the religious orders in northern France. In particular, she was known for the favour she bestowed on the Augustinians. These were a religious order that lived monastic lives in accordance with the religious strictures of St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the great early church fathers. In 1059, agreements were reached concerning monastic life at the Lateran Synod, and this prepared the way for the emergence of the Augustinians as a religious order which challenged the supremacy of the Benedictines across Christendom in the 12th century. Matilda was a major patroness of them in northern France, both during the Anarchy and especially during her semi-retirement, when money could be diverted to the purpose and not towards raising armies, though both the Benedictines and the Cistercians also benefited from her benevolence. She bestowed funding on the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, for instance, an institution which she had patronized for decades, and also on Bordesley Abbey in Worcestershire in England. In all instances, there was an awareness of the political benefits of patronizing religious abbeys and houses which played a prominent role in local politics, something Matilda had become aware of in her early years in Germany and had deployed as a political tool for decades. Her initial patronage of Bordesley, for instance, dated back to the early 1140s, when she cultivated relations there as a means of securing control over Worcestershire in the context of the Civil War. This political scheming aside, there is no doubt that Matilda was a genuine favourer of church reform and revitalisation, and she continued in her later years to sponsor the church in Normandy and further afield. Matilda was far from politically dormant in the years following the accession of her son as king. Though most of the letters involved are lost, it is clear from the chronicles and other ancillary evidence that Matilda maintained an extensive correspondence with her son during the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s, with letters passing from Normandy to England and back again as she advised him on many political issues. One topic on which she tried to advise Henry concerned Thomas Becket, a leading prelate and politician who was appointed by Henry as Lord Chancellor of England shortly after his accession. In 1162, Becket was promoted to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury within the Church. This brought the formerly loyal Chancellor into conflict with Henry as the pair clashed over the rights and privileges of the Church and the degree to which the Archbishops of Canterbury were answerable to the Pope in Rome alone, or had to also seek the permission of the kings of England before acting on various matters. The dispute would intensify throughout the 1160s. Matilda advised Henry to de-escalate the situation. He did not take her advice, and eventually in 1170 Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral, though the degree to which Henry sanctioned the assassination has been extensively debated ever since. She also advised Henry not to launch a military expedition to Ireland in the 1150s to begin conquering the neighbouring island from its many Irish lords. Perhaps she was right. Henry did eventually sanction such a campaign after his mother died, beginning centuries of English entanglement with Ireland. Matilda was into her 60s as her son's relationship with Becket began to deteriorate. She lived eventually to be 65 years old, a ripe old age for the time. Her later years saw her take a back seat in all matters political, no doubt enjoying the frequent visits of her grandchildren to Normandy, from amongst whom there would be two kings of England, King Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, and King John I, two queens, Eleanor, Queen of Castile, and Joan, Queen of Sicily, and also several lords and ladies of other major polities. Her son and grandsons would rule over lands in England, France, Wales, and even Ireland, which became known as the Angevin Empire in recognition of her marriage to Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, while the Plantagenet family name, which she acquired through that same union, was held by the rulers of England down to 1485, when the House of Tudor came to power at the end of the Wars of the Roses. Matilda died at home in Rouen in Normandy on the 10th of September 1167. She was buried at the Abbey of Bec, which she had patronized for decades. Her remains, though, were moved, lost, and found again on several occasions over the centuries, only to find their way to their current resting place at Rouen Cathedral in the mid-19th century. At Bec, her tomb still bears the epitaph, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry." The Empress Matilda was one of the most unusual political figures of the High Middle Ages. During a long and varied life, she became Holy Roman Empress, was involved in the governance of parts of Germany and Italy, while little more than a teenager, then became the Countess of Anjou in the late 1120s, before fighting a major civil war over a period of nearly 2 decades to claim her right to become Queen of England in fulfillment of her late father's wishes. She proved herself a formidable adversary, managing for a time in 1141 to seemingly defeat Stephen and claim her birthright, though the rout of Winchester and the subsequent release of her first cousin snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Admittedly, her unflinching determination to become Queen of England caused much suffering, with the country cast into disorder, economic devastation, and war. But Matilda was not alone in her desire to end Stephen's reign. In the end, her doggedness ensured that her cause survived for long enough for her son to rise to the fore and resolve the fundamental issue which had caused the war to begin with, the prospect of a female monarch. In the end, Matilda was not able to fully realize her father's plans for the succession, but the accession of her son as King Henry II in 1154 was as good an alternative as could be construed out of the chaos of the Anarchy. What do you think of Empress Matilda? Do you think she would have made a great queen had she been allowed to rule by both Stephen and the English nobility? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.